Working abroad can be the most rewarding experience of somebody's life and career. On average, people who work overseas, often called expats or expatriates, find work more interesting, advance faster in their career, and equally importantly, make more money than people who do the same job in their home country. But being an expat can also be dauntingly difficult. When they move abroad, the familiar faces, rules, habits and places suddenly disappear from around expats, and that happens exactly at a time when they must make confident, fast and smart decisions in order to deliver the performance that their bosses expect. I am Gabor Holch, intercultural leadership consultant based in China for over 20 years and currently splitting my time between Asia and Europe. The stress of separation from the familiar places, people and routines would be in itself enough to temporarily challenge somebody's performance at work. But to make things worse, many companies prepare international workers for professional challenges, but not for cultural ones. Expats are sent abroad to solve professional problems. So their managers assume that the talent, training and experience to do that specific job is more important than some vague cultural issues. In fact, many decision makers ignore cultural differences because they think cultures are elusive and confusing and anyway, impossible to measure or compare. But people who take jobs in another country soon find out that cultures are very real when they experience what is often called culture shock. Culture shock is the anxiety or stress that results from having to question and relearn every little thing in a new culture. People in a country with a vastly different culture walk, talk, eat, negotiate, make, keep and break promises, fight and forgive in new and confusing ways. Who can do decent work when you never know what they are going to do next? But international workers and their bosses ignore culture shock at their own risk. Even under the best of circumstances, culture shock temporarily reduces an expatriate's effectiveness and performance. They hesitate more, make more mistakes, get upset more easily, and create more conflict around themselves. In severe cases, unattended culture shock can make people lose appetite and sleep, which can lead to a vicious circle of discomfort and mistakes. A dirty secret of multinational companies is that around a third of expat assignments fail because of cultural pressure. Prematurely terminated international assignments cause lots of damage. Companies waste money to move employees, their families and belongings back and forth. Firms must find and train replacement. Colleagues, clients and suppliers notice the disruption which causes financial and reputational damage to the company. Meanwhile, many smart decision makers like human resources managers and executives know that culture shock is measurable and, as the old saying goes, if you can measure it, you can manage it. Crossing cultures is a bit like sailing unknown oceans. People crossed continents in pursuit of business opportunities for thousands of years. But until scientific map-making, they mostly navigated blindly, following the shore and currents and hoping to get to their destination. Maps enabled navigators to pass down the knowledge about safe and dangerous passages, to predict if a vessel could safely sail to certain places, and even to anticipate continents yet undiscovered. Until recently, decision makers in modern business were a little bit like mapless navigators. Using my focus area of East-West leadership as an example, American and European managers doing business with Asia knew that Japanese and Chinese culture were different from the way people did business at home, but they had no clear idea about the nature of those differences and how to bridge them. As recently as the early 2000s, most cross-cultural business manuals consisted of long lists of practical suggestions, the kind we could call do's and don'ts. What words and body language to use at introductions, where to sit, how to exchange business cards, which words to use and not to use at negotiations, and so forth. The problem with the endless list approach is that it has no system. Knowing 200 curious facts about a foreign culture doesn't help anybody to guess fact number 201 and so forth. Okay, now I know how to greet someone from a specific culture, what not to give as a welcome gift, and the differences between interacting with men and women. But how about seniority differences? How can I express disagreement without upsetting them? And how should I end the discussion? In recent decades, researchers used advanced data technology to collect survey responses from millions of people worldwide and created different charts that explained cultural differences systematically. I will explain and compare some of these in future videos. The most useful and consequently most popular family of tools, however, have been so-called culture maps. Culture maps are simple, straightforward charts that arrange cultures, usually nations, according to simple behavioral criteria. Out of the several kinds of maps I will explain in future videos, the most applicable to business-related decisions are ones that can compare individual behavior, job applicants, candidates for overseas jobs, or managers with international responsibilities, for example, with the behaviors of groups like a country, ethnic group, city, or institution. The best-known culture map in the world is probably the one created by academic Erin Meyer and popularized by her best-selling book, whose title is really easy to remember, The Culture Map. Meyer took data from previous generations of intercultural researchers and arranged them in a behavioral chart similar to DISC, a widely used assessment system for professionals. I added the link to the book to the video notes. In contrast to previous charts that looked a little bit confusing, Erin Meyer's culture map makes it almost impossible to forget where one specific country is located once you saw it there. In my intercultural leadership workshops, we often turn the room into a culture map, make people stand in the place of the country they represent, which can be their actual country or the one they chose for the exercise, and draw practical conclusions together. Once you know where each country is in the map, measuring culture shock becomes very easy. Basically, it's one way of reading the map. You see, one thing you must remember is that the magnitude of differences between cultures has very little to do with their geographic distance. Culture maps are made out of the responses that people gave to survey questions about their habits, likes, and dislikes, not where they gave those answers. In all culture maps, neighboring nations can be in opposite corners of the map, while faraway places can be right next to each other in terms of cultural style. Once you realize this, you also understand that people, even if they spent many years working abroad, aren't able to guess the cultural gap between certain countries. They need culture maps and the millions of data points behind them as a reference. Once a company adopted a culture mapping system and knows which employee they want to send where, using maps as a decision-making tool becomes very straightforward. They must find the nations in question in the map, or if they cannot, ask a qualified consultant to help them place it on the map. The distance between the home culture and the target culture, the place where they want to send someone, tells them how severe a culture shock they must expect while moving someone between the two places. Imagine culture shock like the force of a rubber band connecting two icons in the map. The tighter the band, the bigger the culture shock. Like rubber bands, people can eventually snap if the pressure is too high. By the way, pressure works both ways. An Asian manager moving to Spain can be just as frustrated as a Westerner moving to Asia. I even coach executives to deal with the culture shock they experience when they move back to their home country after many years spent abroad. Maps make it easy to measure the culture shock between two given places, but there are two problems. First, not everybody from a given country represents the culture of that place. In simple words, not every Japanese is typical Japanese, not every German is a typical German, and so forth. Research shows that only about half of a nation's population represent the mainstream culture there. The other problem is that every country, regardless of size, has several subcultures in it. City people think differently from the countryside, cities different from one another, doctors behave differently from musicians or salespeople, and so forth. In recent years, makers of culture maps realized these shortcomings and came up with some quite innovative solutions. The solution to the first problem comes from the fact that culture maps follow the dimensions also used for personal assessment. Erin Meyer's culture map only compares countries, but a coach, consultant, or human resources professional with the right training can assess an individual candidate or manager and place him or her in the same comparative map. This way, it is possible to see how severe the culture shock will be, even if the candidate is not a typical representative of his or her home culture. Systems like the Global Disc Assessment family can compare the candidate's individual style with chosen cultures in simple charts. Decision makers can actually find that the candidate's individual style is closer to the culture of their future assignment than their own home culture. In that case, the candidate will have a great chemistry with the new location and probably be happy and productive there, even in the long run. Of course, the result of the comparison may be a wide gap between the cultural styles of a candidate and the destination, which means the individual culture shock will be much more severe. But that does not mean that the candidate should not do their job. If someone otherwise has the right qualifications and experience, a wide culture gap simply means that they can be selected for the job, but will need more help to adjust to the new environment. The company can surround them with team members who feel more comfortable with that local culture, train them in certain communication or management skills, or pair them up with a coach or mentor to deal with the culture shock. Similarly, which is the solution to the second problem, with the right training in culture mapping systems, it's possible to place any subculture of a given community. For instance, if the destination city's local culture significantly differs from the country's cultural mainstream, the differences can be mapped. The corporate cultures of individual firms can also be placed in culture maps. The Global Disc system makes it possible to account for differences in the cultures of different professional areas within the same country or company. Let's summarize how decision makers at international companies and other institutions can use culture maps to make better decisions when they send people abroad or make them work with people from different cultures. First, bosses cannot expect people to simply arrive at a new country, log in and start working. Culture shock can be a real challenge to self-confidence and performance. To a lesser extent, but the same is true about new partnerships with foreigners in the virtual space. Second, the reason for culture shock is that different people from the same culture can have good or bad chemistry with a specific foreign culture, depending on their personality, habits, and individual work style. Third, wide culture gaps simply mean that the candidate needs more support to be able to perform in that given culture. Finally, the way to measure the level of predicted culture shock is to profile the personal behavioral style of the candidate, then compare it with the cultural style of the destination, but also with the cultural style of the home location. If it helps, decision makers can also make comparison with the culture of the specific destination city, or the corporate culture of the firm, or the professional area, especially if the candidate is expected to move from one function to another. One question I often hear is whether culture maps are 100% accurate. Well, there is no such thing. Think about it a little bit like the X-ray when you visit a clinic. It gives you a fairly reliable initial picture from which, however, your doctor can help you draw the right conclusions through conversation. Similarly, culture maps and intercultural assessment will never explicitly tell you what to do, but they will help you to avoid typical mistakes and make better decisions in the extremely complicated context of the person's skills, ambitions, and environment. I hope you can apply some of this in your daily job, especially if it involves working between different countries. In case you are curious about your cultural compatibility with specific countries or professional areas, in the description you can find the link to my e-learning course, which includes the individual Global Disc assessment. You can also find my contact links in the description. If you want to go a bit further and work with me as a coach, consultant, or keynote speaker, find me online and drop me a line.